following content contains stories and information that some may find triggering. We recommend anyone under the age of 21 watch these chapters with adult supervision due to the sensitive subject matter. All persons in this podcast speak from experience and are not trained doctors or therapists, but simply those who wish to share their knowledge for others to use. Please be aware before continuing on watching and listening to this episode. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another podcast edition of Paolo's podcast. Today, I'm extremely honored because what we've been doing, if you've been following our podcast channel, is we've been discussing our main mission and of sports concussions, chronic pain, physical and emotional, and dealing with mental health awareness and different issues. So previously, if you've been following our library and our podcast, we've been really digging deep into the mental health aspect that I haven't really been able to focus or find anybody that has the same synergy of my symptoms and my story of post-TBI, and until I have the autopsy, but all the signals are facing the diagnosis of CTE. So I'm extremely honored to have, I found this woman in this campaign and her family through People magazine, because since my friends and family are always trying to get me some information, it was in People magazine. She's been written up in GQ, and they have a book that she'll explain more about. Her name is Brenda Easter, and the name of her foundation is CTE Hope. .com, where you could go to purchase it. And her husband Miles works closely alongside with Brenda on this campaign, and they're very passionate. And the reason why is it's a very sad story, but to me it's very encouraging, and it's very brave. And her coping skills that she'll get into with this will hopefully help other parents that might not be suffered from the same situation of the disease of CTE, but give coping skills on the tragic events that it goes through. So welcome today, Brenda.
Well, hello, and thank you very much, Paolo, for having me on today. And I just want to give you a lot of kudos for talking about your experience, and so many of the things that I read about your story are very similar to Zach's. So I think there's a lot of commonality there. My son, Zach, was 24 years of age when he took his own life. And he realized early on in his life that something wasn't quite right. And it took years and years of him battling a lot of the symptoms that we're going to talk about, and for him to really hone in as to what was really the problem with him. And he was smart enough to do his own research. He was wise enough to realize that if there was anything that he could possibly do for himself, he was going to do that. And finally, in the end, he realized in his mind there was no hope. And that's the reason he ended up taking his life. His story started very young, and he went through college. He played a lot of high school sports. He wrestled, he played football. He was a linebacker, and he was not a large linebacker. He was probably one of the smaller of the linebackers, and yet he was probably one of the fiercest players on the field, and size did not matter to him. And so he was never shy about taking on the baddest and the biggest of the opponents. So he loved the sport, and to the end, he truly loved playing sports. His favorite football team is the Green Bay Packers. He would often go up to the field, Soldier Field in Green Bay, and watch the Packers. And it was one of his happiest moments. Yet he knew that the very sport that he loved was the problem and the reason he no longer had a very good quality of life.
What age did that start happening? Because I know obviously we did it. We've spoken previously before this. So his first concussion, did he know this towards the end? And I'm trying to give people a chronological order of the story of Zach.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, back when Zach played, he graduated in 2010. And back when he played, he started playing youth football when he was in third grade because my older son, Miles, was playing youth football. And so he would go along and he'd suit up. And he was just one of those that was fierce enough that it didn't bother him that he was probably the youngest one out there. And so he started playing as early as third grade tackle football. And he remembers, as he started reflecting back on his own life, he believed that his first concussion occurred when he was in fifth grade. And when I think back about it now, they didn't talk about concussion much. They didn't really treat concussions properly. They sat him out for 24 to 48 hours, whether the symptoms had, dissipated or not. They were allowed to go back to the sport and back to school. So, it was, a kind of an afterthought that he realized that he probably had his first concussion in fifth grade while not diagnosed. At the time that we lost Zach, he was very in tune to and reflections of his life brought it back to fifth grade. I do remember in sixth grade, we went through a whole series of serious, terrible headaches. It seemed like migraine, sensitivity to light, headaches that just could not be controlled. And we didn't really know what was going on. He did play football in sixth grade, but it was after the fact from the season that he was experiencing these headaches, and it was just all year round. So we did a lot of doctoring. We went to the doctor for CAT scans. They did MRIs. They did just about everything you can imagine. And in the end, after all of these tests, they just told us it was hormones, that everything that, the symptoms that he had were because of hormones. And I suppose at that age, yeah, maybe it could be some hormonal thing. So you have to believe the doctors. And at that point, I think that's all the doctors probably knew as well. Then he played football, seventh and eighth grade. Ninth grade, he had another serious concussion. He actually broke his arm too. So, there was some, like every other thing, sorry, my lights went off here. Like every other, athlete, you have other injuries that occur. So he had another concussion, but as he thought back through his career, he realized that he had other he calls them dings, but I think he had other smaller concussions, probably also in what we call middle school. So that would have been fifth and sixth grade, or sixth, seventh grade, and eighth grade. And then in ninth grade, he had a severe one and he had to sit out. He also got a stinger and a few other kind of related injuries that put him out for just a bit.
I have a quick question on his first concussion that he had. Since after now, and plus before my previous background as being a sports performance coach, we know now that the concussion doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be blackout, so was to get a little bit of a history on Zach, and because my story is almost identical to his. And the thing that we shared both in our previous conversation is I didn't know that CTE can happen, that he's the youngest I've ever heard of actually coming through with that diagnosis. So the first at Pop Warner, we called it Pop Warner down here, was it a blackout? Because mine was, I was actually knocked out, like flat, and my mother was like, "Oh, my little baby," like in the stands. My father's a coach. He's like, "Don't worry about it, he'll be okay." Went to the hospital. They released me right away. Was Zach's first concussion true? Because a concussion now that I'm finding out could be the butterflies that we get hit. If it comes back, did they send him? Was he out cold and go right to the hospital for a CAT scan, which we don't know if that is the right test to actually get, or an X-ray?
No, his were actually, I call him bell. He would get like he got his bell rung.
Yeah, those
dizziness, but he was never knocked out until later in his career. So, he had to sit out a bit, but then he came back in 10th grade. 11th grade, we started having concussions again. And in between there, he had minor concussions, but none that he really talked about. In fact, he never complained or talked about any of this while he played. I just think his social identity at that time was he was just the tough kid, played through injury and loved the sport. So, I think that was part of his social identity. But then again, in 11th grade, I had him back in the doctor's offices, had CAT scans, MRIs again, massive headaches. He was never knocked out again, but, the concussions were getting worse and worse because, as you have to rest your brain. And back then, the protocols were not the same. And, he was going back to play way too early. And because of that, it was just a vicious cycle. And, and then come senior year, it was we're doing a padded camp the summer in August before their season. And that's when he got another major concussion at blackout or near blackout. And
only first or only time that he was getting blackouts, not. I think ding is such a poor word in the coaching standpoints, because if we get through the kids, like I remember it was like getting hit and they said, "Oh, Paolo, you just got your bell rung. You're okay. Go back in." And as macho, it sounds like Zach was a lot like me, was like, he might be a little bit undersized, but he's going to practice like he plays and play at the next level and be a tough guy. So I'm not coming out because I want to be like my big brother, right?
Yeah. And not only that, but he just took pride in what he did. I mean, he enjoyed the sport enough that, I think especially for young men, that social identity of being tough is important to them, right? I think that's just very common. And he didn't want to let anybody down. So if he took himself off the field, he felt like he was letting his teammates down. And so, he had a major bell ring. They sat him out. He was to the point where he didn't know who he was, where he was, what he was doing. So he would have been very, very close to probably a blackout. Or if there was a blackout, it was just a very short one and he was back, but still very unaware of what was going on around him. And so he sat out at the padded camp, and even then it was maybe a week, because then then the season started, and he was real upset he didn't get to play. Well, finally he got to practice, and then boom, he's back in the game. First play of the game, boom, another concussion. And he was staggering. I prayed he didn't get up, to be quite frank, because I was afraid he'd think it was okay and would keep going. And as a parent, watching that is just, maybe it's just the mom in me, but it was horrifying and heart-wrenching. So, then they set him out for a couple of plays and he went back in. Boom. Again, this time he was knocked out.
Yeah.
So, things are different now. I am so glad to say things are different now. I think the people are much more in tune and aware of things. I know the protocols have changed because I've been one of the primary advocates to make sure in the state of Iowa, our protocols have changed. And I know across the country, that's true for many, many states. But that was the end of his career. However, that was not the end of his symptoms. He was really, I would say, sick for a very long time, couldn't sit in the classroom, headaches. If he didn't have a headache and he saw light, sensitivity to light would bring it right back. He sat in the basement when it was dark for a lot of time because that was about the only thing he could tolerate. He didn't feel well. He felt nauseated, balance issues, dizzy, just felt horrible. And he looked horrible. And that was pretty much his entire senior year. It got to the point where, we took him to the doctors again, right? We went through all the same tests that you normally do. And this time I just wasn't letting him go back. There's just no going back.
Now, was your foresight to say, okay, see, my mother suffered migraines and she never played any sports. So is the difference, and probably kind of in a conversation, hopefully the doctors asked, Zach and yourself or your husband, they asked me personally, do you know the difference between a headache and a migraine? Where the headache is just a bad headache, and it's not belittling how painful a headache is, but a migraine is throwing up, vomiting, nausea, spins, sensitive to lights and everything. So with those symptoms in his past, like through when he was getting in junior high and high school, was he having those? Because you keep mentioning the headaches, and I see when the transition actually happened. And because I'm trying to put like a strategy and almost my independent case study of putting the pieces of the puzzle of, and you're the only person that I've been able to speak to that has actually experienced CTE. Even my neurologists and doctors, they treat it, but they don't. I'm the first patient they're getting their hands on, and I'm 50.
Yeah, early on, when I said in 6th grade they thought it was hormonal, they thought they could be migraines based as a result of hormonal imbalances. So they thought that back in 6th grade, but never once did, Zach would ask, am I feeling like this because of my concussions? And of course, back then, immediately after it happened, the answer is yes, but, after the fact, they never answered that question. They said no. So it was, it was kind of difficult to figure out how to manage that. But it was then that senior year where I started noticing the social isolation. And what you were talking about is very similar. The symptoms are very similar. When you have a concussion, nausea and headaches and dizziness and vomiting and balance issues, those are the very same issues that you can get for many, many things, migraines included, right? And so, I can kind of respect from the medical side how, they might think it's the migraines or it's this or it's that, but it gets kind of convoluted there, because you got to remember when Zach was playing, this all started clear back in 2008. When Zach was playing, they just said, oh, it's just a concussion. Nobody once mentioned to me that a concussion is really a mild traumatic brain injury.
Oh, yeah.
From a parent perspective, I'm like, what? When somebody finally, this is well after we lost Zach, if somebody would have mentioned, hey, this is a traumatic brain injury that we're dealing with, there would be no, from a parent perspective, question that, the protocols that were being followed back then, that you would even allow, because a traumatic brain injury and everything that I've seen, in our research and the people that we've worked with, it's not just a concussion. A traumatic brain injury is serious.
Yeah.
And it gets more serious if you don't take the time to properly heal the damage in your brain. So I like to think of it like this. When you get a broken arm, you have a broken arm, and people know you have a broken arm because you have a cast on, right? They put a cast on you and you're not able to use it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you have your brain that sits up there in your skull. When it's injured, we can't see it. And back when Zach played, an MRI, a CAT scan, you couldn't see that. And actually today, an MRI and a CAT scan likely can't see it. You have to have you have to go to a special PET scan. You couldn't see it back then. And so therefore, things were not working correctly, but you couldn't see it. So nobody really probably evaluated it properly, and we didn't know any better. So we didn't have the study results that we have today. We didn't have any conclusive evidence regarding CTE and the long-term consequences of concussions and subconcussive hits if brains aren't healed properly. So it was back in 2008, from what I'm understanding, around that period, Dr. Bennett Omalu actually diagnosed the chronic traumatic encephalopathy in an athlete, and NFL, and maybe several. And at that point in time, the NFL filed a lawsuit against him and basically silenced him. And this would have been back in the 2008, 2009 timeframe. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, if I'd have had that information, if that would have been put out and people would have known about it, people like me would have made different decisions. But now, years later, things are a bit different. People are approaching concussion differently. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy has been proven in multiple cases of people who have taken their own lives. And let me just give you a quick survey. There was a survey, and this is the one that gets my stomach, it kind of curls every day. There was a Boston University study, and McKee is the one that released the study, of 201 brains. They had done autopsies on young men and women of 201 individuals. 100 of those individuals were former NFL players. The other 100 were athletes like Zach, or bull riders, people who were in collision type sports, and who never played, NFL football. Some of them might have played some college ball, and many of them were just like Zach, who had played in youth and high school sports. Okay. Out of the 101 NFL brains that were examined, 100 of them had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. But what's so disturbing is the other 100. The other 100, 86 of those individuals, like Zach, who never played NFL, who never played college, also had CTE.
I know that one. Wow.
And that makes me stop and think that there are more people who are suffering from the long-term consequences of concussion, subconcussive hits, than people realized. And probably well beyond or before Zach, of young men and women taking their lives that didn't get their brains autopsied, who would have likely have had it. So this has probably been going on for a very long time. We just didn't know about it. And these kinds of studies weren't in play at that time. But it sure put it into perspective for me, and why it was so important to Zach for us to help other individuals, to help them not go through what he did, and for him to make a decision to take his life and donate his brain to science, because he really didn't want anybody else to know or to go through what he went through and to not know why they felt off, what was really the problem.
I definitely want to dive actually more into this point, but also what this topic now that we're transitioning into, where Zach had the courage. Well, I think it's courage. All right. This comes from me because I'm dealing with the symptoms, and I never spoke to Zach, so I don't want to be disrespectful or anything like that. But after reading the articles, reading the books, and reaching out to you and connecting and learning a little bit about the background, is that, like, if say someone, my mother had AML leukemia, and she had a support group so she could speak to another cancer patient and they could bounce off what's the go together. But I've been out there searching, because we're trying to build strength in numbers, strategic partnerships with people that, like us, that are not-for-profit. Is I expanded our demographic, but basically we had the same mission, to go through it. And I'm pivoting back to one of the things you touched on when you said, they didn't say traumatic brain injury from the concussion. And I think back then, especially when I played, if you thought somebody had a traumatic brain injury, you'd only think that happened from a car crash or something from maybe in the military, something serious, somebody coming back with metal plates in their head. And they didn't even mention when I was playing, and even when I was studying for performance certifications, is to, because I'm very passionate about working kids and protecting them, because I believe in these sports. You know, people have asked me and say, Paolo, would you have done this all over again? And I am, the same thing. I get suicidal thoughts at least twice a week, because unless you're in that person's pain, you can't judge them. And I think it's unfair, no matter what, somebody's stance are, is that unless you live inside the walls, especially of the brain, and I don't want to downplay it, but like when you looked at my symptoms compared to Zach's on my website, is there any symptoms that didn't check the box with Zach? Or was his because one of the things that really scared me was before I knew that there was something wrong, but no neurologist, half the neurologists, I told you, because the insurance I didn't have super insurance. They didn't even know what CTE was. I went into the emergency room. They didn't know. And this is current day now. We're going back 3 years ago. So back when Zach was going through, I'm sure they knew about concussions and the problem, but they didn't know about CTE and about the brain damage and how the brain decays. And am I using a wrong example? Because I use this to people that say, what is CTE? And our campaign and my board members like Alex, that helps me out with day-to-day tasks. When we talk about it, they're like, what is it? And I say, well, it's due to concussions. And if they haven't seen the movie Concussions with Will Smith, they don't know anything about it. So was there anything with when I started hearing voices, and they were non-threatening voices, because mental health can be a very scary situation for parents. And like, I don't know if you were able to push through and see the Will Smith movie, but I didn't react like those people on those, like pull my teeth out, very graphic and dramatic stuff. So I didn't identify with that, but it's not that my pain was any less. Or if I hear a voice, it's non-threatening. It's like, I'll hear a voice like, you left the gas on in the stove. So it'll be like that. But if I tell somebody that I don't know, this is what I hear, it scares the heck out of them, because they'll think, maybe I'm the Unabomber or something, but I'm just dealing with a brain disease. I said, I'm not, my heart's in the right place. I would give my life for somebody, and that's it. So did Zach have any symptoms or that I didn't show on my page, or did he mirror everything? Because I didn't get those until I was in my 3 years ago. I'm 50 now, so it was 47.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. One, first of all, you mentioned the movie Concussion, and we lost Zach at the time that the Concussion movie was coming out, and he had said, hey, Mom, Concussion's coming out, you should watch the movie. And it wasn't probably a week later that we lost him. So I haven't been able to watch the movie, but I know enough about it. I've heard people talk about it. Yes, you are correct. The symptoms that you've encountered, not all of them, but most of them are very, very similar. He had memory loss. He had slurred speech. He had blurred vision. He had brain tremors. He had balance issues, sensitivity to light. The biggest thing I think for people is just knowing that the sense that something's off, but you just you don't know why, you just can't put your finger on it. He had suicidal thoughts. He had insomnia, anxiety, depression. So many of the symptoms of CTE, because it has anxiety and depression, I think for a very long time, people thought that those that were suffering from really CTE, they thought it was more mental health. It was, anxiety and just the depression. And in fact, even with Zach, they were trying to probably treat him like that. And, prescribing a lot of narcotics and drugs, sleeping pills, just as you mentioned on your site, they were trying to treat him for the symptoms, which is similar to a lot of the mental health. But what they forgot, or what they never dialed into, is that he had traumatic brain injury. And what happens when you have a traumatic brain injury that lingers or that goes beyond, a normal recovery period is the inflammation in the brain just starts, I'm going to call it suffocating some of those brain cells up there. The negative enzymes and the proteins that start coating those cells just basically cuts the oxygen off. And so therefore they die.
Mhm.
And when that happens, a lot of these symptoms really start rearing their ugly head. Parts of the brain don't work. Other parts of the brain try to overfunction. Zach called it emotional deregulation. They could no longer control their emotions. They could no longer control some of their other like addictions. A lot of people are have addictions to alcohol or even drugs. There are many other things that can be included in addiction and have that addictive personalities. But that's because their brain, the side of the brain that's controlling that, isn't working properly. And so they have no way of controlling. And in Zach's way, in Zach's, let's see, last year of life, he was a saver. He was in the Army National Guard, and he was Soldier of the Year. He, everything that he worked towards, he did well. Once he found interest in something, he was going to do it well. He wanted to go into the special forces. He had, got offered a couple of Ranger contracts to go try. Never worked out, and it was probably a blessing that it didn't. But, one of his last concussions was from one of his trainings when a flash bomb went off and knocked him out. So
we talked about with then people think that it's only coming from sports. So then that's another example. And also too, you mentioned, and I just want to, because another part of our mission is being socially responsible on the information we give out. So I always say I'm not a doctor. I only talk from my experience.
Yeah.
And now by you sharing your experience, we can kind of connect the dots and let the professionals and people make their own decisions.
Absolutely. It's just having the information.
Right. And then, and I want to talk about when you just hit that addiction part, because that was one that is that people, again, with the symptoms that we get, whether was connected to CTE or TBI or mental health, when you get in that type of chronic pain, and if I don't know if Zach went to a pain management doctor, because my body was again, it's like I'm holding back tears right now, because I feel, besides the migraine, all the abuse. Like I told you, I shrunk like 3 inches in height because I played strong safety and then in wide receiver. So all the impact on my spine is collapsing. And with the weight they're putting on with the trial medications, since there's no cure for what we have. And I switched my addictions from opiates because you said that they gave him, and it made him probably feel a little bit better and more comfortable, but it doesn't help the migraine, an opiate. So, and parents don't know that. So that's why I ask everybody to do your own research, advocate for yourself. We got to trust our doctors, but always check the balances sheet. And I think that's why our campaigns, both of ours and others that are out there, are so important to give information, not so much to preach, but just, again, spread awareness. And before I talk about the addiction, is also that you talked about the bull riders and then him being a football player, and it seems like a lot of the PR and media is focusing on all football players having CTE, and I've been working with the USA national women's soccer team, and they're if my information is correct. So I haven't fact checked it yet, but we're having our psych intern program look into it and write a paper about it. Is they feel that the women's brain are more prone to CTE than the male anatomy. So I'm looking into that as well. Why is that the way it sits? Why is it that somebody my age or Zach's friend who was playing linebacker, why did he get the CTE? And the kid who was getting hit just in the head, is this because that's going to be one of the clues, since we can't stop it, is maybe reduce it and put in these protocols of, like I've been mentioning to parents. I said, listen, every success that I've made in business and in my life, I pretty much put towards the sports that I played. It gave me work ethic. It gave me leadership, all the great qualities. Yeah, it destroyed my life. And it's what's did to Zach is terrible, but it's if we can reduce it, because the brain is not fully developed until 25. So if we're playing, he's the same age as me, and he's playing football and he gets a concussion and they're going head to head at like 6 or 7 years old. That's not, we're not built like that. It doesn't matter what type of helmet we have. So do you agree with that whole process that I'm talking about?
Yeah. So the number one cause of concussion is actually falls. And, that can be people tripping and falling. That can be people riding their bikes, falling off their bikes. The number one reason that people get a mild concussion is falling, which makes sense. I don't know how many of you have ever fallen and bonked your head on the cement or, whatever, but collision sports are right after that. And, car accidents are another form of concussion. So where you can get traumatic brain injury. Now, I also want to point out there are three different measures of traumatic brain injury. The mild traumatic brain injury is concussion. Okay, it's that similar. It's really what that is. Then you have moderate and you have severe brain trauma. And a lot of the moderate and severe, some of it can be, the moderate can happen at birth. A lot of times the severe happens in car crashes. So there are three different levels: mild, moderate, and severe. And I think people don't realize that either. And so the mild traumatic brain injury or concussion was, I want to say, overlooked for many, many years because, concussion was just not that, big of a deal. And we now know it can be a big deal if you're not very careful and allow your brain to heal. As far as, the addictions are concerned, because you've had the damage to your brain and it's not functioning already by itself, and then you add narcotics and or other types of, drugs in there, you're not going to get the results, because treating the symptoms alone is not going to help you. And so they had Zach on uppers and downers at the same time, sleep pills, you name it, just all kinds of things. And that starts the addiction, because narcotics, as you know, just by virtue of anybody taking them, are have an addictive point to them. And you just have to realize that, if you're taking them, because the brain is already damaged, I don't think you're always thinking clearly and remembering, did I take my meds? Did I not take my meds? It got to be that bad with Zach. And then taking uppers and downers, uppers to get up and downers to sleep. That's not healthy. They had him on Adderall because he had focus issues, and it just became one hot mess. And those addictions just grew because of that. And so I can remember him saying, I'm just not taking this stuff anymore. Zach was a firm believer of healthy lifestyle, and he was able to manage his symptoms and a lot of his not quite right with healthy diet and exercise.